I know, never shake the magic 8-ball. The bubbles never go away. But I like to. So the question is the magic 8-ball useful? Ooh, reply hazy. I never really knew what that meant, but I have a strange love for the 8-ball anyway, and for some reason I found it inspiring when I was stuck on a problem. Seeking answers and ideas from random objects seems to be something that most people experience. Let's call this a thirst for divination, a drive to find meaning. I found out I'm not the only one who uses divinations as a tool. A while ago, I happened to meet a designer by the name of Chris Noessel. He's the senior design fellow at Cooper Design in San Francisco. You could call him a sort of guru of design, a guy whose job it is to think about what makes design tick and what we can do to make it better. I had the chance to talk about this divination idea with Chris for a while, and he told me about what he calls meaning machines. As it turns out, when I brought this idea together with Sergei and Trisha, the Pinball Rules creative and science experts, those random questions that we ask cards, stars, and the things around us is something that unites us as designers. So back to the 8-ball. Would designers benefit from a little divination? Yes, definitely. Hi, I'm Joe Unger, and this is Pinball Rules, where we find out what it is to design for humans. Stick around as we talk divination, design, and meaning machines with designer Chris Noessel and the Pinball Rules team.
So my name is Chris Noessel. Although when I publish under my full first name, which is Christopher Noessel, because I think it makes me sound smarter. And I am a 20-year veteran of the design world, everything from being a small business owner to working for giant, huge companies like Microsoft, all the way to now where I am I'm the design fellow at Cooper, an interaction design agency in San Francisco.
What would you say would be one of your most memorable moments in design?
I would say the mural that I did in the basement of my undergraduate dormitory, which featured the Bill Watterson character Calvin in the place of Adam, holding out a finger to touch the Michelangelo Buonarroti God. Turns out I would not have thought that was my most memorable thing, but apparently tons of people loved it. So let me cite that as one of my most memorable moments in design, even though it was graphic design rather than interaction design that I do now.
You know, that really brings an interesting point, is that kind of constant push and pull between what is art and what is design. And having so much experience, kind of doing a little bit of everything across design and being a design thinker professionally, where do you think that line is?
To me, is the moment of design is that it has the effect that you want. And art is much more about expression and creating something that is rich and evocative as opposed to effective.
That's one way to approach meaning, right, is through art. And then design, we approach meaning through other things. And your most recent work has been dealing with meaning machines. What is that about?
Well, it's a bit esoteric, but it's something that I get terribly excited about because I think it's so neat and sort of juicy for brains to dig into. Meaning machines is a term that I've coined to describe the semiotic machines that we use to derive meaning from randomness. I first came across it when a few of my friends back in Houston, that's where I grew up, on a lark wanted to go to a palmist, a palm reader. And I am a huge skeptic. I've been since I was a kid, but I was like, okay, let's go. We'll do this thing. And we sat down, and each of us had gotten a reading from this palmist. And I found the whole thing hokey and a little off-putting, but certainly the readings that she had said was spoken in a flowery language that I wasn't familiar with, and so I think it kind of stuck with me. And a few years later, I was visiting a friend, and he was telling me about his foray into feng shui, of designing his apartment and the furniture and balcony, all according to these principles. And what struck me was the language he was using was nearly identical to what the palmist had used. And that echo, that connection, I thought, well, I really need to pursue this. And literally it just stayed there in my brain, this connection that needed investigation and some kind of name, until years later when I came late to the semiotics party. And the minute I began to learn semiotics, I realized that what the palmists were doing and Feng Shui was doing was very much the same thing. They were randomized signs inside of a fixed grammar in order to find new meaning. So in the case of Feng Shui, it's more of a deliberate exercise. The sort of design use of that is to say, okay, here are the effects I want. I want to focus a little more on family. I want to do whatever it takes to bring money into my life. Well, then here are the things that I'm going to place in these rooms in this way. And in palmistry, the randomization is not so much, oh, hey, how did you decorate, but the biology of how the swirls in your hand formed. And as soon as I sort of found this deep structure that was under these two things, I began to find it in almost every kind of divination that I found, which was sort of delightful. Oh, hey, here's a grand unification theory for divination. But I began to see the pattern elsewhere too. There were similar machines that used randomness to create entertainment that was hilarious or shocking or musical. And then there are even other rarer meaning machines by which we can create things, both in a design sense and an art sense. So a long answer to a short question. That's sort of how I got to this idea. I mean, if I had to shrink it up into a tiny, pithy sentence, meaning machines are the systems by which we harness randomness for new meaning.
One of the things that stuck out to me was tarot. There is a game, and cartomancy in general, that seems to fit that definition of meaning machine.
Oh, like entirely. In fact, I would say that it is the canonical example of a meaning machine. And so many people are familiar with it that it's often the very first one that I turn to when I'm trying to find an example and say, okay, well, if you really want to know what I'm talking about, let's talk tarot.
What do you think it is that draws us to it?
I think, and this, I should also fess up here that I hold a party every year in December called the Divination Party. And I do it around the new year, and I invite a whole bunch of friends in, and they bring both favorite and beloved divination techniques, but they also bring like wacky ones that they find throughout the year. And it's a fun way just to celebrate the old year and look forward to the new year. And tarot always has a place at the table at the Divination Party. And when I watch people who are doing it, I think part of it is that there is a beautiful ritual to it that is very familiar. It sort of fits us socially because it gives us something on a table between two people to talk about, or even a small crowd. I think it's sort of certainly very lovely. You can't ignore the aesthetics. I've even there's so many different versions of tarot now, but the artists who undertake to do a new tarot deck, it's not a light endeavor. It's rich with meaning, so they get to make them really beautiful, really lush. And ultimately, I also think it's useful. Even if you don't believe in a mystical agent sort of putting invisible fingers into the deck to make it come out a certain way, it is a machine that provides you with things to think about, things to look at, and even the opportunity to sort of refocus your life on what we tend to agree is pretty important, like love and family and, financial affairs and transitions in your life. So for those reasons, it's a really well-honed machine that fits us in all those beautiful ways.
From the perspective of a game designer, it's this deck of cards that seems so fascinating and has so much imagery, and its history is in the 1400s in Italy, and essentially rich people buying extra cards for their deck. I feel like it's Magic the Gathering almost, and and that will we look at Magic the Gathering with 200 years from now and say, they knew something that we didn't. What is it about the tarot imagery that has makes it such a good machine?
Most of the meaning machines that I've uncovered as examples are analog in nature, meaning that there is the sign that you're randomizing is physical in nature. And the card is perfect, right? It's perfect. It fits your hand. Most folks know how to shuffle, and even if you don't know how to shuffle, no big deal. You can just sort of move the cards around on a table and restack them into the deck. So they have that great ergonomic sense. They fit your hand, so they're easy to manipulate. Because you are manually manipulating these things, there's a size limit to the group of things that you can manipulate. And you couldn't really shuffle, and if you played Magic the Gathering, you know this, a 500 card deck. It's too much. The Tarot doesn't certainly have 500 cards. It has enough that you can reasonably shuffle. But there's a trade-off, right? If you're limited to the number of signs or signifiers that you can have, then the number of meanings that you can put onto those things might be similarly limited. What's lovely about the Tarot is that the amount of meaning that they can put onto a single token, like the card, is really rich because they use illustration to capture all those possible meanings. The number of possibilities is really rich, and it only comes about by using something that's either free form, like reading a tea leaves, or something that is rich, like the lush illustrations in Tarot. You can imagine if you had a meaning machine that you could just press a red button and see a result, it would not be as satisfying. Typically, the analog machines make you work for it, and that's cool. That's part of the ritual, part of the fun, part of how you can gain a bit of expertise in it other than memorizing the explanatory text. I think it was last year, actually, we did a Tarot spread using the cards from Cards Against Humanity. Yes, it was sort of ridiculous and silly, but actually it turned out to be pretty instructive as well. And that's just like the grammar of the machine using different tokens, different signifiers, and it still holds up. So there are tons of reasons why the Tarot and its patterns are really effective and capture our imagination.
Wow, the Cards Against Humanity Tarot matchup that's just sounds crazy fun. It's like, what does your future hold? Oh God, no. Not that, anything but that.
That would be like, somebody, I hope one of your listeners actually gets inspired to write like Tarot for terrible people.
Right. Where's that deck?
Fantastic.
I mean, come on.
Exactly.
All you got to do is put it out there. It's really interesting to hear you use a lot of that language because a lot of it's, of course, a language of design. The fit of the card deck in your hand goes towards usability, and the depth of a card goes towards discoverability. And those are two huge points when you're making entertainment, particularly that you want. You want something to be highly approachable and deeply discoverable. So when you're thinking of the individuals that set up like machines like this, do they fit into your definition of designer?
To answer the question, I'm going to turn to this other giant pool of thought that is very much in the nerd design category. But that is the Christopher Alexander notion of design patterns. He was writing about architecture, but he had identified his example was a barn in the Midwest. Certainly, few people who made those barns had any blueprints for doing so, but you would get a small town together and they would have a barn raising, and there were certain rules that folks just knew from the last several barn raisings they did on where are the walls, where's the door, how large are the eaves, how thick is the roof. So is the barn designed? Well, certainly it is, but not in the same way that we ordinarily think of the act of design from a designer. In a similar sense, we could take a look at evolution, right? Yes, the creatures that we have in our lives, the species that we think about are designed, but not in the way we typically think about it. And I think the Tarot is very much similar. I believe it evolved not with necessarily a design mind, but it certainly is designed. It has been iterated so often, both from the perspective of designing the cards, but also of people doing Tarot readings constantly all over the world, such that those best practices are emphasized and the things that don't work are sloughed off, that we end up with something that is very designed.
So that actually gets to a good point. When I first came in contact with your machine idea, as an entertainment designer, we work a lot with exploring an existing world that we've created. Do you think that there's a difference between machines as you've defined for creating new ideas versus machines for exploring existing ideas?
Yes, I very much think so. There is divination. Tarot is the canonical example for that. There are entertainment patterns, which are things like Cards Against Humanity, which aren't really used for sort of large order questions, but just for humor, for pleasure, for entertainment. And there's that third category of creative machines that are a lot looser. They're not as discrete in the sense of fixed meaning, not the sense of, don't tell anybody. They produce, where entertainment machines produce very discrete results, creativity produce very loose results that allow for interpretation and building and development. And that to me is kind of the ultimate end goal because I'm a designer professionally.
Have you used tarot as a design tool to solve a problem?
In my younger days, and I really just don't have time for it much anymore, but I used to play, a huge gamer, and I used to play a lot of role-playing games. And actually, the first time I ever ran into anything resembling tarot was in Dungeons and Dragons. There's a magic item called the Deck of Many Things. And if you don't know the magic item, it's like your character draws from a deck, and then some giant thing happens permanently to him or her. And I really couldn't fathom what the heck is this doing in my storytelling tool. It was just this randomization, this giant die that was affecting the story in ways that I never really processed. But if I actually think about my design practice, I actually have not picked up a tarot deck to help inform it. But I have used similar systems. David Byrne produced a deck of cards called Oblique Strategies that is very tarot-like in that it is a deck of cards and they are meant to be used as prompts. But when you draw one, it gives you sort of a mind-bending question that you're meant to apply to whatever creative task you have at hand. And I've worked with some teams at Cooper, and just at the start of every day, when we get in, where our brains are fresh, we would turn over one of those cards and spend 5-10 minutes just talking about how this weird, mind-blowing question applies to our problem at hand. And we would let it open up our brains to new possibilities or to understanding the space a little bit more. And in some cases, we would be like, yeah, that really has no play here, but it was a pretty cool way to start the day.
So is there a special card or set that is meaningful to you?
I tend to pick the sun. If you remember the card, it's the one with a little baby on riding on a horse, and there's a brick wall, and there's a sun in the sky. The meaning of the card is one of sudden and authentic revelation, and that to me is sort of I've been an autodidact all my life, super nerdy, not afraid to go in deep and try and learn things. And that moment of revelation is one that I really cherish in my life. So yes, if I am asked to pick a tarot card, it is the sun card to represent myself.
Thinking about that in the larger context of machines and this ability for creative machines to unfold meaning to us, do you think that games in general, that this is a power of just all games?
Humans have the tendency and the desire to apply meaning to almost any noisy, random thing they see. And games which have a degree of randomness, I think, naturally sort of invite that. So I am trying to test my working definition by removing parts of that definition and seeing if I could find examples of that different thing. And the example I came up with a random system with no meaning was something like jacks. There is no meaning that I've ever learned to that game. But the minute I thought of that, I thought, yeah, but you could.
I was going to say, that sounds like a challenge.
Yeah, exactly. Like you could apply meaning to that sort of thing. So since randomness is such a fundamental aspect of many games, then I would say that, yes, it does invite the application of meaning. And then the designer's challenge comes to be, well, what meaning fits this randomness?
As storied as you are across multiple variations of design, how would you define design?
The definition for me of design is the optimization of a system for a set of effects. And that's it. If you are to design a poster, you're thinking of a system of typography and imagery and cultural meanings for the set of effects of, I don't know, selling a couch or announcing a play or getting awards through the AIGA. It's just a set of effects that you are twiddling with whatever system, and that ends up being the medium that the designer is working in to optimize for the set of effects.
From well-recorded academics to the millions of everyday thinkers, finding and giving meaning is more of an obsession than a hobby, and has given us a way as a species to find meaning in random things. The Pinball Rules team took on this topic. What are these meaning machines anyway? What is the role of divination in design? We discovered that science and industry are still using similar tools today. Something called divination in a different time is often called a psychological test today. Sergei explains.
Yeah, we seek meaning. Yeah, we try to interpret visual information in visual patterns in a way that is meaningful to us. And there are many examples of that when we discover objects that are not there. And Rorschach test, which maybe we are talking about tarot cards. I mean, there is very clear parallel between these two objects, the Rorschach test card and tarot card. Rorschach test card is it's a pattern, very simple pattern that could evoke different meaning in different viewers, and you would see what meaning is created trying to analyze the personality. In tarot cards, the images are more complex, they are colorful, they are culturally meaningful, they are loaded with symbols, religious symbolism, spiritual symbolism, but they would evoke different meaning from different people. That's why I believe they're used in certain schools of psychology as ways to analyze your personality. But you could think of this as different steps in meaning, from very simple visual meaning where you just identify an object. You would see it as a butterfly or a skull. In the case of Rorschach test, and in tarot cards, they are richer, which would evoke some emotional response, some chunk of story, maybe some episode from your life. So I think it's useful to think about hierarchies of meaning, from very simple sensory meanings where you identify patterns of light as objects, chairs and cups. These are meanings, affordances that we mentioned, to more complex meanings which have cultural significance and personal significance.
Meanwhile, something like tarot, meant to divine our future, is helping creatives self-critique and see their projects in another way. Trisha walks us through.
And it all boils down to what questions are being posed. When you're only self-analyzing and you're only asking yourself questions, they're only going to be questions that you can answer. The outside tarot flip or the magic 8-ball or whatever it is that you're divining is posing questions that you wouldn't ask yourself. And that's incredibly important for a designer. If they don't have other people that live in that same world to bounce those questions off of, you can flip over a card and all of a sudden it's talking about ambition, and you stop and you question, what is it that I'm going for? What is my ambition there? And that's the most important part. The visuals of tarot change from deck to deck to deck, to culture to culture. It can be goofy animals versus Gothic Victorian versus very classic. And there are some rules to it, but they bend the rules as far as visuals go all the time. But each one of the cards represents a certain ideal, and every card can be posed as a question.
So are you stuck on a problem? Need to find a new perspective, or just want to create something new altogether? Why not divine your design? I'm Joe Unger, and this has been Pinball Rules, where we find out what it means to design for humans. Thanks for listening. Pinball Rules Podcast is recorded in San Diego, California, featuring your hosts Joe Unger, creative commentator Trisha Williams, science commentator Sergei Gepshtein, audio direction and original music by Michael David Peter, and production assistance from Laura Rapaulski. More information on our guests and downloads can be found at pinballrulespodcast.com. Pinball Rules Podcast is a copyright of Pigeonhole Productions, 2015.